Coffee is very good for the brain. There are immune cells called foam cells that will spit out messages that contain in them little microRNAs that go through the blood-brain barrier and cause inflammation in the brain. And there's ways to more or less intercept this message. One molecule that does that is chlorogenic acid, which is really rich in coffee, and also yerba mate tea.
Nick Norwitz, a medical doctor and a PhD.
Nick specializes in metabolic health and nutrition. He has made a name for himself as a clinical researcher and educator on brain health, the microbiome, and mental health.
In my early 20s, I started to really suffer with inflammatory bowel disease. I went from being a high-performing athlete and being able to run like sub-3 marathons to being, in and out of the hospital, brain fog, very fragile, having to put effort to get out of bed to go to the bathroom. The options are basically die or try something and hope that it works. So I just kept on trying things.
With advanced training from Oxford and Harvard, he's on a mission to empower people to take control of their health.
Are there any natural ways that you can boost the metabolic flexibility?
Nutrition first. Even more important than exercise, even more important than sleep or light exposure. Those are all important. With metabolic health, it doesn't matter if you take the low-fat vegan route or the high-fat keto route. At the end of the day, if you feel good and your markers are good, that's the evidence.
What are some of the most exciting strategies for preserving our gut health and the gut-brain connection?
One really interesting thing about the gut that people should know is that
Nick Norwitz is an MD, PhD researcher whose mission is to make metabolic health mainstream. He graduated valedictorian from Dartmouth College, majoring in cell biology and biochemistry, before completing his PhD in metabolism at the University of Oxford and his MD at Harvard Medical School. Nick has made a name for himself as a clinical researcher and metabolic health educator, speaking and writing on topics ranging from brain health, the microbiome, mental health, muscle physiology, mitochondrial function, and cholesterol, lipids, and so much more. His mantra is stay curious. Okay, today I am so excited for a guest that has just been so entertaining to me, but also so educational. Today we have Nick Norwitz. You are a medical doctor and a PhD. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. Very excited to be here.
Of course. First, amazing accomplishment for you just finished your MD, right? Recently at Harvard?
Yep, about a month ago.
Amazing.
A lot of school. Yeah.
That's a ton of school. How much schooling was it in total?
Of higher ed, 11, 12 years. And for reference, I'm 29. So, if I started school when I was around 4, basically my entire life's been in school. I've been a real adult for about a month. Feels good though. And I enjoy being a student, lifelong learner, but I think moving on with a little less structure can kind of follow my passions. I'm very excited for my 30s. Ooh, they're coming.
Yeah, that's a ton of schooling, but I agree with you. Lifelong learning is just so exciting. And plus, there's so much new literature coming out all the time, right?
Yeah. No, I think it's nice to have even more time now to just dig into whatever science enthuses me. So generally, I'll get up at 4 a.m. and just read whatever new thing is out in Cell Science, Nature that is ooh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I love that.
My nerdy time when my insomnia is acting up.
Hopefully that's not too often, since we know sleep is such an important pillar.
It is admittedly my Achilles heel of my health routine. I try my best, but I think it's one of those things where, you try your best and then it's best not to get overstressed about it. So if I can't sleep early in the morning, I just get up and start my day.
There you go. Well, you have a very, I think I would say, unique approach to metabolic health, nutritional sciences. What kind of inspired that, and what's really kind of led you down this, maybe we'll call a rabbit hole of all of the interesting, potentially controversial information out there?
Yeah. There are two answers to that question. One that starts very early on in my life or one that starts later. I'll start with the one that starts early on in my life, which is I was always a pest when it came to asking questions. I just always asked questions, always very curious. And to my parents' credit, especially my father, where it could be very easy to kind of quash that interest, he always encouraged it. And he always said, look, if you get a question answered from me or anybody else and it doesn't satisfy you, keep asking. If people get irritated, it probably means you're onto something. And so that's the spirit I kind of grew up with. Always very curious, always loved the biological sciences. And then that dovetailed with something that happened later on in my life. In my early 20s, I started getting pretty sick. which was new for me. I was a very healthy adolescent and child throughout most of my life, but I started to really suffer with inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis in particular. And over the course of several months and melding into years, it really took um, basically all my quality of life away. I went from being a high performing athlete and an academic to being in and out of the hospital, brain fog, very fragile. In a period of 2 years, I went from being able to run like sub 3 marathons to like having to put effort to like get out of bed to go to the bathroom. So it was quite debilitating. Um, and at that point in time, I was actually at Oxford doing a PhD in human physiology. And it wasn't any academic exploration that really turned me on to metabolic health. Truly, it was desperation because nothing conventional was working for me. So I do what a lot of people do in that scenario, which is you just start throwing spaghetti at the wall, pardon the pun, trying different things out, seeing if anything helps because, the options are basically like linger as you are with no quality of life, die, or try something and hope that it works. So I just kept on trying things, including many different diets. And eventually I tried a ketogenic diet for my inflammatory bowel disease and it worked like a charm. My symptoms went away, my inflammatory markers dropped. On the next colonoscopy I had no disease activity as proven on biopsy, and, at the time, I was just happy that I was healthy and re-engaging in life. If it wasn't for my dietary changes, I wouldn't have finished my PhD, I wouldn't have gone to medical school, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you now. Um, that didn't evangelize me in any way, shape, or form towards a particular way of eating, but it did stimulate me to get curious about the field of metabolic health because what I tried wasn't, quote, evidence-based. And so that was the frame with which I went into the rest of my graduate studies and then through Harvard Medical School. And I think what really became apparent to me, and it's kind of obvious on paper, but I really internalized it through my personal experience, is that quote unquote, for people who are listening, I'm doing air quotes, evidence based medicine is not built with the incentive structures in order to investigate metabolic health interventions for the metabolic diseases that are plaguing society today: obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, neurological, mental health conditions. All of these are fundamentally metabolic,
Mm.
but our current research and medical infrastructure does not support investigations, rigorous investigations for metabolic therapies for those metabolic diseases. So what we're left with is the pharmaceuticals and the procedures, which can work, but they might not necessarily be the most effective. So in paying homage to quote evidence based medicine, we actually miss potentially the low hanging fruit and what might be most effective, not because it doesn't work, but because the system we have doesn't invest in doing the studies necessary to make them standard of care, which means patients like me, and there are so many like me, whatever the disease might be, end up suffering kind of unnecessarily because their physician can't recommend based on quote evidence based care what probably will work best.
Yeah, that's such an interesting, and I hear a lot of the same comments, right? I had a medical clinic and I understand, the process for that. How was it for you going through Harvard and kind of having this, I don't know, called awakening or something, that there might be these better options? What was that experience like?
Um, it was frustrating, and not because like I'm not like pointing fingers at any professor or my classmates. It was just frustrating for the reasons I described, that like everywhere I looked, it was very clear the system was not built to really serve patients with metabolic health diseases, which is most of them. And compounding on that frustration is the frustration I see, in my peers and in physicians. I know from the patient's perspective, because I've been sitting in that chair, I've sat in that chair a lot. You have an interaction with the healthcare system, and it just all is one big mush. The doctor to the system, they're all blended together, and the doctor is the patient-facing person. So they often take a lot of the blame when things aren't working well. But the fact of the matter is, the system makes it very difficult, I think, for physicians to provide optimal care for their patients. There's so much bureaucracy and so many obstacles that it really is just a business model meant to make money, not put the patient first.
Mm.
And everybody I spoke to, all the wisdom and insights I gleaned from my peers and also from my superiors made that very obvious to me that we have a broken system. And that's what ultimately, well, that and my personal experience led me to making a very big and difficult choice for me, which was at the end of medical school, not actually applying to go into a residency. Now, for those who don't know the system, that is like a very taboo thing to do. It was never something that was even laid out as an option for me to take my years of education and then not go to a clinical residency, which technically means I can't practice as a clinician. I have a medical doctorate, but I'm not doing the final step of training, just the very end to get past the finish line where I can, like, say, prescribe medications. And, there are advantages to going the standard route and being in the system. But what I realized is the idea I had about working hard in the system to get to a place of influence to change the system was a pipe dream, that it wouldn't
Mm.
actually work. At least not, I don't think it would work as effectively as trying to disrupt things from the outside. So I kind of gambled my future on going a different route, which commenced a month ago, and we'll see how it goes. But I became very frustrated with what I saw as a patient, as a student, and I think things need to be disrupted, shaken up, and I think there's a lot of will to see that happen, not only from the general public, and we can talk about that, but also from inside the system.
Mm. Well, I mean, I love that, and I'm sure you're gonna be doing just fine. I think you have, like, 300,000 subs on YouTube, so I think, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a bold move. I was talking to my husband last night, I'm, like, telling him all of your credentials. I'm like, "He did all of this, and he's doing, YouTube," which is amazing because you can just impact so many people, and I love that that's the time that we're living in, honestly.
It's complicated. It's I was talking to a friend about this the other day because, whatever silo you grow up in, you know, it, um, teaches you to internalize that a particular path has certain prestige.
Mm.
So, I grew up in a medical household. All my friends are, like, in medicine and science, and the correct path to do is the one I actively abandoned.
Yeah.
Um and I did it because I feel like I could have bigger impact, but when you try to explain exactly what you're doing and the opportunities that arise, is really difficult. I struggle with it. Then I talked to some of my friends who, like, went to Harvard Medical School, and they're like, "So you quit medicine to be an influencer?" I'm like, "I guess if you wanna choose that word, fine." It doesn't it doesn't really matter what word you choose, but the opportunities and knock-on effects I see from being at that intersection of academia and interacting with the general public are massive. So, yeah, there's the superficial layer, kind of the tip of the iceberg, if you will, of you get to educate people and see people respond, and that's lovely. I love that. But the opportunities to engaging and starting as the chief scientific officer from really exciting startups in mental health and metabolic health, or running research projects in metabolic health, which I'd never be able to get done via the standard route. So, like, you get out there, you're public, you have a message, you might meet the right billionaire philanthropist who says, "Here, take $10 million, do this RCT." I can never get that money from within the system, and I have access now to those resources and tools, and I'm building that network so that hopefully you're right. Hopefully I can have an impact, and you kind of have to. It's different because in medicine, it's a very clear path. Everything is secure in some way, shape,
Mhm.
or form.
Yeah.
You're gonna do well. You're gonna go, like, it's laid out for you. This space, I don't really have I think a good model to base what my career is going to become on. So I'm building the bridge as I walk across it, which I really love. It brings some people in my social circles anxiety, but I love it. And the opportunities that have arisen for me over the last year, uh, they just keep on exploding. And I'm so excited to explore this space because I really feel, social media, it definitely has its faults and can create a lot of harm. But if we use it correctly, I think it can be one of the most powerful tools for true patient empowerment and helping people take back their health where the conventional model has failed. Not because of doctors, but because the system and the incentive structures are dysfunctional.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I saw, there was, like, a network of, I think, like, 1,000 different clinics, obviously employing, a ton of different doctors, and they said about 10 years ago, almost no patients were asking for, like, root cause medicine, right? Or asking, "Why is this happening to me? What else can we look at?" But now 80% of the patients are. So, clearly, just by I think the impact of social media really and things like what you're doing and, people that are just putting it out there, I think it's really gonna make a shift, like, from the inside eventually.
Yeah. I think one of the most powerful things you can do is like give people an appreciation for how complex metabolism in their body is, because when you can awaken that shock and awe and that really humility, it goes very nicely with the curiosity whereby I see then people engage in what I call N equals one science. I obviously didn't coin that term, but the idea of saying, look, I'm not just going to take a general prescription that may or may not work for me. I'm going to treat my life like an experiment, choose the outcome that I think is important to me, create a hypothesis about what might impact that outcome, and then engage in the process of iterating my lifestyle in order to continually, like, improve my life towards the outcome I care about. And guess what? If something doesn't work, I'm not going to judge myself. Those are data. Then you come up with another hypothesis. It's not about getting the silver bullet off the bat, but that process, if you truly and authentically engage in it, inevitably leads to success. It can't not. That is a scientific process. It always develops and evolves your model in a productive manner.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do, so many labs. So that's the exact process, me and my medical team are always going through. It's like, does this work? Here's some data on it. But, it doesn't always work. Sometimes it works phenomenally. But, you have to go through the process to see because we're all so unique.
Hmm. Yeah.
So excited to get into metabolic health. I mean, I think that we can all agree that there's like a metabolic health crisis, right? You probably know the stats really well, but I think I saw something along the lines of like 6% of people in the US are metabolically healthy. What is your take on that? How do you think we got there? And I would also love to just talk about how, our metabolic system works, and then we'll go into actionable tips.
Sure. Um, I would say in the health space, there are some terms that are very like clear and I guess from what we call like science operationalized where you can define them, and others that are more umbrella terms. Like you know it when you see it. And metabolic health is one of those things. So depending on how you define it, you'll get different numbers for what percent of people are metabolically healthy and also what causes metabolic dysfunction. I can't just give you one answer because there isn't
Mm.
one root cause. And speaking of root causes, I think that is actually a good way to describe it. So, by way of analogy, if you imagine like a tree of disease, metabolic diseases, and you have all these branches, say obesity is one branch, cardiovascular disease is another, diabetes is another, neurological disease is another. They're all part of the same tree. They all have the same roots, but I do emphasize roots. So, various lifestyle factors, sleep, diet, exercise, stress. It's boring, but it also is fundamental. And these lifestyle factors kind of all converge on basic underlying biological processes. People might hear about like mitochondrial function, inflammation, oxidative stress. And you can't really separate one from the other. So you hear all these terms bandied about, but they're really linked together, almost like
Yeah.
the visual of Olympic rings in my brain. So we can talk about any given one of them. And what I really love to do is like break down new science, but I would caution people, and I'll caveat up front that when we talk about these linear pathways as science dissects, you're only looking at one piece of the puzzle. And so to take a step back and try to see a bigger picture, it always does come down to these fundamental metabolic forces like mitochondrial function, inflammation, oxidative stress, and the lifestyle factors that target them.
Mm.
So I think that's a decent framework for thinking about it, and then you start to increase the resolution of your picture as you start to, delve into different mechanisms, read the literature, and just start to break down the science, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, I would love to go a little bit deeper and think, this is what you're so great at. Like any new or emerging literature and, what people might be able to do, obviously the basics, but I would love to like drive it home so that people see that if you do X, it correlates directly to Y, because we all know in health, let's call it, that you should be sleeping well and eating well, but maybe if we can give them some recommendations like, is strength training or hit training better for mitochondrial health?
Yeah.
Maybe we can kind of dial it in a little bit.
Sure, sure, sure. So, let's think. All right, I got one. This is some content I did recently ended up being more popular because it's why it's jumping into mind. But let's create something or treat something that is a little bit more abstract or seemingly abstract, mental health. Let's say depression.
Mm.
What is depression fundamentally? I mean, it's a mental health disorder, but it has its root in the brain. Now, the brain is really hard to study. It's a little bit of a black box because you can't really do in vivo experiments in humans. People always ask when I go over the mouse studies, oh, why didn't you study human study? I'm like, because to dissect the mechanism, you have to chop off heads. Yeah, your brain staining. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer for that, but there was a recent study um, that I covered that was really interesting, talking about the basic metabolism behind depression. And so I'll break it down to just kind of give an example. Depression can be caused by more activity in certain regions of the brain. One region of the brain is called the lateral habenula. I remember that habenula sounds like habanero, and habaneros are pretty spicy. Kind of think of it as aversive. So lateral habenula, depression center of the brain, or one of them. And now, if you turn up the volume on that center, you can get feelings of like despair. And the way in the brain you kind of turn up the volume is you have more excitatory neurotransmitters. One is called glutamate. Um, and what was found is that certain stressors, say like chronic stress, be that social or otherwise, can change a process called autophagy, which maybe your listeners have heard of. It's kind of the cellular recycling process in the brain, but in a way that leads to buildup of the receptors for the excitatory neurotransmitter. So effectively, you can have some external input, some stress input. Maybe it's a dysfunctional or abusive relationship. Maybe it's work, or family stuff, health stuff. But that changes this process of cellular recycling in the brain to increase levels of receptors for the excitatory chemical in the brain, leading to more activity in this brain region, which can lead to what we experience as depression. And I like that example for a few reasons. One, it takes something that seems very abstract and fluffy and puts it in very concrete mechanistic terms. I think, medicalization of mental health issues has its pros and cons, but in this case, I think it's a big pro because it's saying, look, this is a fundamental biological process that we can start to understand. And in developing that understanding, you can develop potential solutions. So interestingly, with respect to this mechanism, one of the other things they did in this research was look at the mechanisms of actions of different antidepressants,
Mm.
because it's not even very clear how antidepressants work. So if you take like SSRIs, which do increase serotonin, but the way they actually, or the timeline over which they improve depression doesn't sync up with how serotonin rises. So there's other mechanisms. It increases autophagy, specifically in this brain region. Same with ketamine.
Interesting.
So different mechanisms of, what we know work for depression, or at least in some people, converge on this metabolic mechanism. And then you can start to hypothesize, oh, maybe there are metabolic interventions that could help via acting on this pathway. So what increases autophagy? Well, carbohydrate restriction, intermittent fasting. Could intermittent fasting work for depression? It's possible. Again, has it been really assessed in a rigorous randomized controlled trial? No, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just doesn't mean it just means we haven't invested in exploring that metabolic health intervention. So I think it's starting to uncover the metabolic mechanisms. We can develop hypotheses that any individual can experiment with, because say intermittent fasting might work for some people, might not work for others. But I think that's one example. Go into a lot of other examples of these mechanisms, but the high level point here is whether or not we understand the mechanisms or the full picture, there are metabolic underpinnings that we have the ability to dissect, and we're just in the process of doing it. That's what science is.
Interesting. Yeah, that is I really love that example. That is a great one. Talking about brain health, what are some of the most exciting strategies for preserving brain health and cognitive decline that you don't think are talked about enough?
That's a hard question. The you don't think are talked about enough is I think the key term. And just so people don't ding me, exercise, sleep, generally healthy eating, those are givens. So I'm not overlooking those. They're just, everybody knows about them. Um, so let's think things that are more novel. Well, I would advocate, maybe this isn't that novel, but for a ketogenic diet, and I'll give a rationale. And I think the rationale is novel. A few reasons. People might have heard about how ketogenic diets increase ketone bodies, which are great brain fuel. They also, decrease inflammation in the brain. But there are other mechanisms that are just being uncovered about how they could prevent neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So I'll give one example. There was a paper that came out recently which showed very interestingly that ketone bodies, the molecules that are made on a ketogenic diet, they can target misfolded proteins in the brain to basically have them become insoluble and then get cleared out. So basically, it's like the ketone bodies, like say your brain is like a messy apartment. The ketone bodies go around, see all the trash, are able to identify the trash. So they can tell, oh, that's trash on the ground, not a throw pillow. They identify it, then put it in a trash bag, and then take out the trash. We can link content I did to actually review the new science, and I had an exclusive clip in discussion with the first author. But that is really remarkable because what it's suggesting is not just that you're like blindly upregulating a clearance process, but that basic molecules made by virtue of a dietary macronutrient shift can actually selectively target dysfunctional and misfolded proteins. How that works is still kind of like a next level of discovery, but I think that is truly fascinating. So that's one thing that can be good for brain health. What
Quick
else?
question on that
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah.
Is this mostly working through only the mechanism of actually being in ketosis, or can you take exogenous ketones?
That's a very good question. Exogenous ketones theoretically should work. Technically, it's harder to stay in like deeper ketosis with exogenous ketones, but no, it should apply. So often the question that comes up is somebody wants to go low carb, but they're having trouble getting into ketosis. Can they boost it with exogenous ketones? So say you're eating 50 grams of carbs, it's hard for you to go lower, hard for you to get into ketone levels above zero point 0.5 millimoles. Say you're hovering around 0.4 or you're at zero point 0.5 and you want to get to like 1 plus millimoles, and yeah, exogenous ketones can work. That is a big hairy kettle of fish as to which to take. Um, Based on some research that a colleague you might know, Dom D'Agostino, and his wife shared with me,
Yeah.
I'll just like put a plug in for I think ketone salts that are actually a race mixture, which means they have the D and the L form might be beneficial.
Mhm.
Sorry, it's a little bit of a tangent, but there's some research suggesting the left-handed form of the ketone beta hydroxybutyrate might stick around in the brain longer. So even if you can't measure it, because it's not always measured on like a finger prick, you might end up with higher brain levels over a longer period of time. It's a little bit speculative, but since you brought up the question, that's a little bit of a nuanced note on ketones and exogenous ketone supplementation.
But what I find interesting is that the entire conversation, because to be in ketosis, right, you're eating more fat,
Mhm.
and then the conventional kind of discussion around eating more fat has been, historically, obviously it's changing now, has been that might not be so good for you or for your brain. So
Yeah.
I'm excited that, new emerging literature is coming out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the literature suggesting a high fat diet is bad for the brain is at all. Like ketogenic diets, there's no evidence to suggest that they are bad for the brain long term. In fact, the majority of evidence that I've seen suggests that they would be very brain healthy long term. Also, bear in mind when people are making that claim, sometimes a high fat diet refers to really a high fat, high carb diet. So if you do like large population studies, and this happens all the time, where people say like keto like diet. This came out in one paper, one headline. Keto like diet is linked to X, Y, and Z negative outcome. And what is a keto like diet? Well, they see keto like and they translated that from high fat. Well, what was the high fat diet? It was like 45% calories from carbs.
Oh.
So relatively high fat versus like if you're taking guidelines at 60% of calories from carbs, but it doesn't actually mean ketogenic.
Mm.
And so most of those studies, if not all of them, large population scale studies, don't actually have people in ketosis. They have people eating like 200 grams of carbs per day. I've done out the math on some of these studies. And like, I could go get like a Dairy Queen Blizzard and French fries and a burger and still be quote low carb keto like.
Oh my gosh.
So, sometimes when you dig into the references, it's not that great. There was another paper that came out about high fat diets and neurological disease.
Mm.
And it was funny. It was a large scale population study, and then I was going through it. It was an okay study. It jumped to some conclusions, but then I was going through the discussion section and looking at biological plausibility, and they're trying to throw saturated fat under the bus.
Mm.
Like, oh, well, saturated fat could do X, Y, Z, and that could lead to negative brain health outcomes. And they cited a study. Um, Now, they said in the discussion section, saturated fat is bad to the brain, XYZ study, link study. You go to the study, and what do you think the intervention was? Why?
Carbs again. High carbs.
It was a mouse study where the diet was an HFS diet, which stood for high fat, not saturated fat, high fat sucrose diet. It was a sugar diet. But that still gets, can get through peer review. And then you can see how that snowballs into media headlines that are very misleading. Where, yeah, mice fed a sugar diet leads to blaming of fat and saturated fat for brain disease. I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous when you lay it out like that. But if you ever sit on the reviewer end of peer review, and I mean, I have, when you review a paper, you're not getting paid for it. You're
Mm.
generally not even getting acknowledged for it. This is like a volunteer service that you're spending your free time doing. If you get a manuscript and there's 114 references, you're not going through each one. So these things slip through. The peer review process is not a meritocracy and it's not perfect. The best we have right now, but you can kind of see how these myths get propagated because generally once something enters the medical zeitgeist, it's easy for it to keep its inertia, and it's really hard to re-steer the ship. So a little bit of insight there.
Yeah. So then your thoughts on saturated fat from what I'm gleaming.
Probably, if you want, oh, we can get into that, but I have a few more things for
Oh yeah,
that
let's
appreciate for brain health.
let's go back.
I can bounce them off quickly. People will love this. Coffee is probably very good for the brain. And yerba mate tea as well. So there's a really interesting paper that came out about how the heart actually talks to the brain. And I literally mean the heart talks to the brain. The heart, like if you have little plaques, there are immune cells called foam cells
Mm.
that will spit out messages. I mean, little spherical packages that contain in them little microRNAs that go through the blood-brain barrier and cause inflammation in the brain.
Wow.
That actually happens. And there's ways to more or less intercept this message because the message will activate inflammatory pathways and you can bump them down by activating certain antioxidant and anti-inflammatory pathways like NRF2. So
Mm.
there are many ways to do that. One molecule that does that is chlorogenic acid, which is really rich in coffee, and also yerba mate tea. So that's another thing. Uh, Dogs, dog lovers, and owners are going to love me for this, and cats actually. There's a new paper out in Scientific Reports showing that pet ownership, dogs and cats, although not birds and fish, sorry, bird and
Mm.
fish people, was associated with much slower cognitive decline. And there's other literature explaining how that might work, including improved social interactions and really changes in brain chemistry. The science of dogs, which I'm going to cover in its own content series, and we can get back to if you want, is actually really fascinating because they co-evolved with us, and in so doing, they kind of hacked some of our neural circuitry,
Interesting.
and it can have real benefits for mental health and potentially brain health. I'll just kind of share one tidbit, which I think people will find interesting. When you look at a baby, like a human baby, you have a, oh, it's so cute phenomenon. But if you look at a puppy, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
What that probably comes from is we evolved, particularly females of the species, this concept of mutual gaze. When you lock eyes with something, and then there's an oxytocin boost, the love hormone, the cuddle hormone in your brain, and this helps with forming social connections.
Hmm.
It's part of the basis of mother infant bonding, and domesticated animals, domesticated dogs in particular, stimulate the same pathway. So there was a paper out in Science where if you take a dog and its owner and you have the dog look at the owner with a prolonged gaze, it'll get the same oxytocin boost as from, a baby looking at a human. And then actually, interestingly, if you infuse the dog with oxytocin, the dog will look at the human for longer. So it sets up this positive feedback loop that people think, at least I think, it makes evolutionary sense that dogs, during their domestication, would have hacked in to the system we've established for social connection because it allowed them to secure their place by our side and then eventually acquire food. So might be one of the reasons you have the same "aw, so cute" phenomenon when you look at a puppy and you lock eyes with them, but also that same hormone has anxiolytic, like, stress-reducing properties and changes brain chemistry. So there's lots of reasons dogs can improve health, but, like, they can actually improve the brain chemistry. And then a fourth example based on a new reading I was doing is GLP-1 receptor agonists. Now, this is gonna be controversial,
Mm.
but even beyond weight loss, GLP-1s might be very good for the brain. So there was new research that just came out showing that GLP-1s activate this enzyme in the brain called AMPK,
Mhm.
and that actually leads not only to decreased neuroinflammation, but inhibition of the key enzyme that generates amyloid in the brain. It's called
Mm.
BASE1. So basically, the GLP-1 can shut off BASE1, and it
Mm.
reduces amyloid production. If you look at humans, there's an inverse association between GLP-1 levels and amyloid levels. And if you do these experiments in mice and you boost GLP-1, it
Mhm.
decreases BASE1 enzyme, decreases amyloid, and improves memory
Mm.
performance. So there are probably, use cases for, say, GLP-1s. Now, we don't know yet if you, say, can microdose or if this interacts with certain genetics. Like, I have high risk genetics for Alzheimer's disease, but I don't really want to lose any weight. So
Yeah.
we might be developing like microdosing protocols. So yeah, what did I go over? We went over keto, chlorogenic acid, dogs, and GLP-1s. I think everyone covers the basic interesting brain health stuff.
The studies on GLP-1s, I actually did a small microdose for a little bit, but it actually made me, like, not wanna eat at all. I was only taking 5 units, and it just suppressed my appetite so much, and personally, like, I don't wanna lose really a lot of weight because I like my muscle mass. So, I'm wondering how many of these studies are done, or do we have studies yet? Because 'cause I'm not up on the literature, of GLP-1s in, like, really healthy people, or do we think that it's because the people that are taking them were, like, kind of so unhealthy in so many different ways that it's improving it?
Right. Of course, there's a matter of background context and metabolic health context. I think you're right that the preponderance, if not basically all the data right now, is being collected in the context of people with metabolic disease in some way, shape, or form. I think there's one phase 2 trial looking at cognition as a primary outcome, but even then, people have pre-existing mild cognitive impairment. So there are studies with cardiovascular disease, there are studies with obesity and diabetes, obviously. I don't know of any studies in people that are actually healthy. So you're right. If at baseline you have low neural inflammation and you're healthy, the effect might be reduced. But we
Yeah,
don't know. But I thought the mechanism was really interesting because it's not just like people think, oh, it's just weight loss.
yeah.
But there are weight loss independent effects of GLP-1s. We know this,
Mhm.
based on a lot of literature. And I just think it's interesting, not because I'm advocating for taking them, I've never prescribed a GLP-1. It's just a matter of there's so much dogma in the space, really dissecting the mechanisms behind these things and thinking, oh, this is so fascinating. I think it just reinforces that it is metabolism at the base of, all of these conditions. The fact that a quote obesity drug might have direct actions on neurochemistry leading to Alzheimer's disease, even in a weight independent manner, I think is more proof of the principle that it is all metabolic health rather than saying this drug is the holy grail. It's not just one molecule. So I thought it was just interesting though.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. Is there a newer, like, version of GLP-1s that I've been hearing about?
There are several. The one you've probably been hearing about is Tirzepatide. So it's a combination agonist, which means that it's not just activating the GLP-1 receptor, it's activating something else called the GIP receptor as well, and it tends to have a little bit of a greater weight loss effect. Um, I think it's quite interesting, and if I were to say, I'm not prescribing it, but if I were to say recommend it, say like for a family member, I do think Tirzepatide has certain benefits.
Mm.
One thing it does that GLP-1 receptor agonists don't do is it actually increases the metabolic flexibility of fat cells. So fat cells don't have that many GLP-1 receptors, but they do have GIP receptors. And if you chronically stimulate the GIP receptor, which Tirzepatide does,
Mhm.
Ozempic and Wegovy don't, what ends up happening is the fat cell itself becomes more flexible. So during, after a meal, the postprandial period, it's better at taking up, say, glucose, so keeping your blood sugar stable. And then during the fasting period, it's better at releasing fat, lipolysis. So there's a way in which tirzepatide, this combination agonist, kind of second generation type GLP-1, does enhance metabolic flexibility in a way that, Ozempic and Wegovy don't. So I do think it has additional benefits. potentially, and the weight loss effects are slightly larger.
Yeah, I'll have to get the name. I've heard even, like, a couple other names floating around, and I'll have to drop it in the show notes or send it to you and get your opinion.
Sure.
But that's super interesting. Are there any, let's say, natural ways that you can boost, the metabolic flexibility?
Oh, yeah, I mean, again, here's an interesting thing about metabolic flexibility. It's a nice concept, and the way I just described it with the Tirzepatide, you do want that. You do want the ability to, say, during a period of fasting, release fat,
Yeah.
because then you can burn fat as fuel, you don't get, like, a crash and, you don't get hangry. But the body is very adaptable. So say you stay keto for a really long time, you will become worse at using carbohydrates, and technically you're, quote, "less metabolically flexible."
Mhm.
But it is adaptive for the dietary context that you're in, and you could readapt. So there's, like, a longer arc of metabolic flexibility.
Mm.
But and this is boring, but I would say achieving metabolic flexibility in the practical functional sense, you can do by just getting metabolically healthy, which brings us back to those pillars. Like, you know, I think first and foremost, people can debate me on this, but I think nutrition first. Even more important than exercise, even more important than sleep. Yes, I'm saying that. Or light exposure. I know light's really hot right now. Those are all important, but I think nutrition first. And once you got that more or less dialed in, making sure you have your sleep, your exercise, yes, maybe your light exposure, and stress reduction, practices kind of in place. And then the nice thing is, you can identify your Achilles heel. You can kind of start to tweak and modify things. But with metabolic health, the proof is in the pudding. Doesn't matter if you take the, low fat vegan route, if you can be successful there, or like the high fat keto route. At the end of the day, if you feel good and your markers are good, that's the evidence, you know? So, you can look at your metabolic markers. Are your inflammatory markers low? Is your lipid panel appropriate for your dietary context? Et cetera, et cetera. So I would say the proof is in the metabolic pudding.
Yeah, I agree with that, so thank you. Side note real quick, going back to dogs, what do you think, this is not a medical question, but what do you think about this new idea that AI is gonna be, like, able to translate what the dog is saying to you?
I would never say never with AI. I would say it's probably I mean, this, if to be clear, like, this is not an area of expertise. I've never read a single paper on this theory. So this is me speculating as a relatively well-informed person in general, but not on this topic. Um, I see no reason why it couldn't have pattern recognition for, various modes of communication. So, like, interpreting based on just, like, bulk input of exposure to dogs,
Mhm.
body language, facial expressions, sounds, and then give an output for something that is a probable statement based on the context and the breed about what they're trying to communicate.
Hmm.
Maybe. And I mean, once AI gets sophisticated enough, it's going to learn about the individual dog. So it will train itself based on your dog. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to be like word for word, because unlike humans, dogs don't speak in like an inner monologue with like English language.
Mm.
So there will be, like, a quote language barrier, because that's not how dogs think. We might anthropomorphize it that way, but they don't. But could AI be developed that translates dogs' thought processes and emotional tones and needs and desires into English language? I see no reason why not.
Well, I mean, with the dogs having a lot of negative thoughts about the owner that could impact these dog studies.
Yeah, there's a little vibe. But no, no, no. I'm a big dog fan. I used to have dogs. Don't currently, because of medical school and everything. But I think it's time to get a dog again. So
Yeah, I don't have a dog either, and really never have, but I know people really, really love their dogs, so it's
yeah,
good that they're
good
so
health
healthy.
fact too.
Yeah.
They actually, there was a study, they reduce in infants food allergies by 90%.
Wow.
Um,
Wonder if it's just
90%.
all the microbes on them?
Yeah, I think just like, antigen exposure and training, and they're also like incredible screening tools.
Hmm.
Um, they can detect cancers with like 95% sensitivity and specificity in like less than 10 seconds. And this is a podcast, but in case any of this goes up on YouTube, I'm not going to say the C virus word, but everybody knows what I'm talking about. They've been used with also about 95% or better sensitivity and specificity for detection of that pandemic virus.
Wow.
So compared to PCR, they can literally sniff the virus. And it makes sense when you think about it. Any disease state, it's going to give off some unique volatile organic compounds, and dogs can smell like 1 part per trillion. So yeah, they can smell out melanoma and viral infections in like 10 seconds. And a PCR test for that virus takes like a day or more, but
Yeah.
a dog can sniff it. It's kind
That's amazing. I saw this video on Instagram, but I didn't know it was real. So thank you for confirming that about the.
Yeah, I can send the paper. There's a few papers out. It's under this like umbrella of One Health about animal and planetary health with a direct impact on human health. But it'll be part of my Dogs as Medicine content, which is a newsletter and a video I'll have coming out soonish. So it was a fun little rabbit hole to go down.
I love that. Well, let's kind of move to cardiovascular health. Are there any emerging compounds, supplements, or dietary approaches that you believe are really promising for the elasticity of our arteries and cardiac aging?
Elasticity of the arteries. Yes, actually, as it happens. Well, at least there's a marker you can track and potentially try to modify. So there's a really interesting paper out about this biomarker and enzyme called myeloperoxidase. Big word. It goes MPO for short. You can get it like a Quest lab or something. You just go into Quest and look up the code. But what myeloperoxidase is an enzyme that promotes oxidation and oxidative stress. But here's the interesting thing about it. It acts at the blood vessel in kind of like a metabolic pincer maneuver. And what I mean by that is it can attack the blood vessel from the inside, the lumen, out and the outside in. Now, the inside out is a less interesting thing. So it can oxidize LDL, so you get more oxidized LDL, and it can just kind of damage the blood vessel. So that's kind of boilerplate. The new study, though, was super interesting, and it ties into, we were talking about poor metabolic health and obesity, is if you have excess fat, you also end up having excess fat around your blood vessels. It's called perivascular adipose tissue. Perivascular around blood vessels, adipose tissue fat. So the name tells you what it is, perivascular adipose tissue. And this perivascular adipose tissue also creates myeloperoxidase. The levels correlate with blood levels, but it is a separate pool.
Hmm.
And this does some very fascinating things, including decreasing the beiging and browning of the fat tissue. So there's actually a decrease in energy expenditure.
Hmm.
That's one element. But then what it does is it decreases another hormone called adiponectin. And you asked about elasticity of the vessel. That's why it came to mind. Um, Adiponectin, by way of analogy, it's kind of like yoga for your blood vessels. It does make them more elastic. And in decreasing adiponectin, the MPO from the outside in makes the vessels potentially more stiff. So just to reiterate, there's this enzyme you can measure. It's kind of a marker of oxidative stress. Oxidizes LDL, damages the inner lining of blood vessels, decreases the beiging browning of fat tissue to decrease energy expenditure, and decreases levels of adiponectin, which increase the vessel elasticity. So what you could do to lower MPO is a lot of different things. Basically, a lot of the metabolic health interventions we went over. Eating an anti-inflammatory diet, sleep, exercise, and then measure it over time to see if you can actually get it to go down. Um, you know, there's some suggestion that certain pharmacological agents, including statins, might have an effect on MPO, which I think is interesting. Something people should know about statins, not by any means advocating for them, but people think of it simply as it just lowers your LDL and your ApoB. It's not just that. They do many other things. And in people with poor metabolic health, they can lower inflammation and oxidative stress, which is one of the reasons they might have benefits on various disease conditions that are completely independent of lipid levels. So often these medications have lots of different effects. So that's one answer to your question. I'll pause my monologue for questions, and then I'll pop off with a couple other ones that I think are pretty interesting.
No, I think that's great. What do you think about like it's seaweed derived? Have you ever heard of arterosil?
Arterisol, I haven't. No.
Yeah, that's an interesting one that we would, sometimes use. Some of their data shows that it can help with
Mm,
a little bit of the flexibility.
interesting. I hadn't heard about that. I can look into it, but
Yeah, I'll send you
that
that
isn't.
one.
I think one of the most underrated nutrients might be vitamin C for heart
Mm.
health. I went down a rabbit hole on this recently after doing content on Lp(a). It's actually my most popular newsletter of all time, and I think it's because this molecule Lp(a) is now getting talked about more and more, but people don't really understand it
Yeah.
well. And one of the really interesting hypotheses around Lp(a) is that we evolved to have it as a surrogate for vitamin C. So we'll elaborate on
Mm.
that a little bit. Vitamin C is important for wound healing, among other things. And most mammals can actually make it. But about 40 to 60 million years ago, we lost the ability to make it.
Hmm.
And so we might have needed a kind of a substitution, which came in the form of Lp(a), which has distinct but overlapping wound healing properties. So, like, if you get, a cut, you want it to clot up, scar over, so you don't bleed out. If your interest, and as a species our interest was, acute survival,
Mhm.
rather than per se health span or longevity. Now, there are multiple lines of evidence suggesting that this might actually be the case. I think the comparative evolution ones are pretty cool because if you have this hypothesis, you might posit that okay, other animals that don't make vitamin C might also have Lp(a).
Hmm.
And is that the case? Yeah, it is. So, European hedgehogs and guinea pigs both also independently lost vitamin C capability, and then they developed Lp(a). So most animals don't make Lp(a). Like mice don't on their own make Lp(a), but they can
Hmm.
make vitamin C. So some animals lost vitamin C and then gained Lp(a), and it actually seems like a pattern across evolution. And then there are quite a decent number of studies showing that vitamin C can improve cardiovascular outcomes. There are many different mechanisms by which we do so. Potentially making Lp(a) less sticky. This is a very complex topic. It might not actually reduce it, but it might make it less sticky, so it's not sticking to your vessels as much. Reducing oxidative damage, um, and then increasing levels of other heart supporting compounds by increasing levels of something called tetrahydrobiopterin, and it becomes quite complicated. We can link the resources on that if you want, but I think vitamin C is a pretty underrated heart health hack, and its interaction with Lp(a) is pretty fascinating. Also, add that the person who came up with a hypothesis around that, Linus Pauling, had not one but two Nobel prizes. So the guy was kind of smart,
Yeah, that's amazing.
and so his ideas are now being rediscovered. Let's just say.
Have you heard of using phosphatidylcholine at all for like reducing soft plaquing?
Not for that indication specifically. I do know a little bit about phosphatidylcholine as a conjugate to omega 3s for brain health, but that's the context with which I'm more familiar. Uh,
I want to send you, yeah, an interesting paper on phosphatidylcholine IV therapy and potentially, reducing these soft plaques. So, at my clinic, there's an IV therapy called Plaque X, and the primary ingredient is this phosphatidylcholine. And the results, like clinically, I mean, I don't think there's any like, peer reviewed research on this, but clinically, like, have been really good. So, it's kind of exciting.
cool. Yeah, I'd love to look at the paper.
Yeah, I'll send it over. Anything else that you love or are excited about for like cardiac health?
Ooh, I mean, there's a lot of things. I will bring back up that chlorogenic acid again. We talked about it in the brain section,
Mm.
but it actually did have that direct tie into the heart. Um, so just to kind of describe it a little bit more, in cardiovascular disease, part of the process is activation of these foam cells. So these immune cells that actually get into plaques and then kind of become angry and inflamed. The way I think about it, I'd never heard of this analogy from someone else. I can't believe somebody else didn't come up with it, but if they haven't, but like it's kind of like little hulks in your arteries. So like Bruce Banner is getting angry and oxidized and becoming like these little hulks that are smashing everything up. But the chlorogenic acid that we mentioned about intercepting the signals going to the brain to improve brain health probably helps directly in the heart as well. And there are a large body of evidence, at least associational, but the associations are pretty consistent and strong that coffee consumption might help with cardiovascular outcomes. So definitely get sleep. But yeah, if you like coffee and tea, definitely don't be shy. One interesting thing I will add though is There was a study that came out, I'm blanking on the journal, but it was a 2025 study where they looked at coffee and health outcomes, and they found a positive relationship, but only for morning coffee drinkers,
Mm.
not throughout the day coffee drinkers. So there might be benefits to having all your coffee before noon or predominantly before noon. Now, why this isn't very clear. There are two explanations that come to mind. One is the boring one, which is if you drink coffee late at night, you get poor sleep, and then, poor sleep will beget poor health outcomes. But the other aspect that I think might be even more interesting and compelling is that your body operates in cycles,
Mm.
and that includes inflammatory signals. So inflammatory markers actually, as they're going through cycles, tend to peak earlier in the day. So it might be a matter of timing the intake of coffee's anti-inflammatory compounds with the peak of your inflammatory markers and signaling molecules. So food for thought, coffee good. There
Yeah.
might be a little cognitive bias there because I love coffee, but
Yeah, I do too. Does it say anything in the studies about the quality of the coffee?
generally they don't dissect based on what the source of the coffee is. In the large scale studies, that is very difficult to do. And then when you're doing controlled trials, generally there are not enough resources to have multiple arms from different brands of coffee.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's easy to partition based on that. Most of the studies I've seen have shown pretty broad benefits, be it like instant coffee, filtered coffee, what have you. Even if you add milk, sometimes even if you add sugar, I'm sure on net, I would say that's going to negatively impact your health. But does it actually negatively impact the health benefits of the components in the coffee? Probably not.
Mm.
Light roast coffees and green coffees tend to be higher in polyphenols and chlorogenic acids, so there might be a little bit of an edge to a light roast coffee over a dark roast. Potentially.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I try to opt for organic, but I think it's great that just any coffee across the board is, pumping out some seemingly incredible benefits.
Yeah.
Um, okay, let's talk about the gut health, our gut health and the gut brain connection a little bit. What is something about the gut brain connection that people should know that they might not?
I would say the high level things are we don't really know what a healthy gut looks like in humans, not truly.
Hmm.
Fiber is a hit or miss. And what I mean by that is it can help some people and harm some people. So there are studies where showing that some people get an anti-inflammatory response to fiber and some people actually get a pro-inflammatory response to fiber. So it is
Mm.
highly individual.
I wonder if that I was gonna say, I wonder if that just depends on what the composition of the gut looks like, because we know if you introduce fiber and there's, let's say the wrong type of bacteria that can actually have issues fermenting it. So maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, so this was out of the Sonnenberg lab at Stanford, and to your point, in the study that it was a 2021 study, I believe that showed that they did show that those who were inflammatory responders to fiber tended to have lower baseline diversity.
Yeah.
Which begs the question, can you train the gut to respond better to it? Kind of like progressive overload. And what I would say is theoretically it's possible. The protocols have not been worked out. And often with the gut, it's a nice thing to say that, oh, you can feed it and make it healthier. And to some extent you probably can, but in an adult human, the microbiome can be very resistant to change. So the protocols aren't that well worked out. Does not discourage anybody from trying, but I'm not. There's no data out there yet showing that you can convert a inflammatory responder to a anti-inflammatory responder. In theory, we should be able to. We just don't know how yet. And I will just add, there are insults to the gut from the environment that just seem to stick around and potentially put certain people behind the eight ball. So I'll use myself as an example. When I was a newborn, I had a very high fever, something like 106, and I got IV antibiotics for that, which is probably the right choice at the time. Didn't want me to have any brain damage. But if you get IV antibiotics that early on in life, it can screw up your gut for life. So it can increase your risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease by about 500%. And you develop that generally in your late adolescence and your 20s, which is when I developed it. So something was potentially sitting dormant in my microbiome for a long time that predisposed me to develop a disease years later. If we're going to have an effect 20 years later, I don't think any amount of like kimchi is going to like overpower that. Kimchi also being a fermented food, but yeah, fiber, I would say it's a hit or miss. The majority of the literature probably says for most people, most of the time, from whole foods, it's a net benefit, but it's so individual.
Yeah.
So, I eat a low fiber diet, makes me feel better. But I'm definitely not anti-fiber. There's some really interesting research on fiber. Actually, there was a paper that just came out on one called ACE cell, which isn't just a fiber. Fiber's kind of the Trojan horse. It's actually acetate, the short chain fatty acid conjugated to cellulose, a fiber. And it allows the acetate to get into the colon, which has pretty impressive weight loss effects, at least in animal models. It ends up decreasing glucose and sugar availability to the body. So you end up depleting glycogen, and then it kind of mimics a ketogenic diet. So this is not just a fiber, it's like a fiber max, and it's not yet available for commercial use. But fiber is a very misunderstood and complex area. So anyway, I think it's interesting. One really interesting thing about the gut that people should know is that you can change how your gut bacteria is fed without changing your diet.
Hmm.
What do I mean by that? Your psychological state can change your gut bacteria. So your brain talks down to your gut via, among other things, the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve. Very complex nerve. And when you're stressed, regions in the brain, including the amygdala, I believe it's the central amygdala, send a message via the vagus nerve to glands in your gut. They're called Brunner's glands. And it can change mucin production. And mucin feeds certain bacteria. So literally, your like state of stress, or if you're at a very high stress level, can decrease directly via a nerve to glands in the gut, mucin production, and starve off certain bacteria. So completely independent of feeding, which is pretty cool, I think.
Mm.
And I think that's important and kind of speaks to the importance of stress reduction practices, whatever those might be for you.
Totally. If you don't have anything else on that, I want to end on this. I feel like it's being quite widely discussed, but maybe it's just in like our tiny corner of the internet. This sugar diet situation that people are doing.
Yeah, yeah. This one caught me off guard when it popped up.
Same.
It was one of those things, like, you hear these, like, ridiculous diets always going on, and there's so much, like, as a content producer, there's so much to cover. Generally, if you see something like that, you're like, "Alright, move on. This is gonna go away in a little bit." But I was getting my arm twisted left and right, and then what really drew me with genuine interest towards it was, it wasn't technically a sugar diet paper, but a paper came out in Nature Metabolism, which is a very highly regarded journal, on, 3 separate human controlled trials on protein restriction. Now, what a sugar diet is it's a very low fat, very low protein, high carb diet. So it is a type of protein restricted diet. And what they showed in this study is that protein restriction, including high carb protein restriction, not a sugar diet, but a high carb protein restricted diet, boosted levels of this hormone called FGF21, which the liver can make. And FGF21, they showed, goes to fat tissue and changes fat metabolism to an extent that energy expenditure went up by 600 or about 600 calories per day. So 20% increase in energy expenditure. I think in study one, it was 574 calories. Without any changes in activity or changes in thyroid or other hormones known to be involved in energy expenditure. It probably had something to do with uncoupling the fat cells, but they did show in 3 separate studies that protein restriction increased FGF21, and that this increased energy expenditure by 20%. That is no joke in terms of effect size. So it provides an explanation for how the sugar diet could actually work to increase energy expenditure and lead to weight loss, including fat loss. Also, the FGF21 is muscle sparing. So certain hormones prevent muscle loss. FGF21 is one of them. So yeah, the sugar diet, there's reason to think it could work. Now, I did a content review on the sugar diet on my YouTube channel and my Substack, and then thereafter actually got in touch with the primary research team that did this Nature Metabolism study. And I had talked to the first author. We went back and forth via email. She actually was nice enough to let me disclose our conversation in my newsletter. So it's at the end of the newsletter. But a few things I asked her, and one was could this be generalized to people with obesity? And there's reasons I thought no. But apparently, they're already doing follow-up studies that have been put in for peer review, and it does appear these protein-restricted diets could provide these same metabolic benefits in terms of increased energy expenditure for people with obesity. So, could actually be a pretty potent weight loss tool. Doesn't mean I'm saying you should do it. There's different ways to skin a cat. It also doesn't mean, because people get confused, that like if you eat a lot more protein, it'll slow your metabolic rate linearly. It's probably a threshold effect. So if you get
Mm.
below a certain level, and the studies it was 9% calories from protein, it would boost this hormone. And then there were the effects on longevity. So there's another study that came out, an animal model study showing that FGF21, when you increase it in fat tissue, can increase lifespan.
Hmm.
And it can increase lifespan without slowing metabolic rate, which is usually what happens when you see these studies that increase lifespan, without really significant decreases in muscle mass. In fact, relative lean mass went up substantially. So the way it's pitched, this hormone is almost like a metabolic holy grail. You live longer, you expend more energy, you have more relative lean tissue, and you can eat more calories. Like, too good to be true, probably is. But the research is super interesting. And so, long story short, with the sugar diet thing, is it a good idea? No, I don't think it is. But I do think it speaks to really fascinating underlying metabolism that we're just starting to uncover. And that singular paper, if people want to go try to read just one paper, that was one of those rare papers that actually changed my perspective on something. In this case,
Mm.
protein needs, high protein versus low protein, and whether or not there's actually benefits to protein restriction. This paper kind of convinced me, and it's very rare that a single paper will do that. But it was a pretty compelling piece of research.
What was the time frame?
So the human study in the Nature Metabolism paper was a 5-week study.
Okay.
So another one question I had for the authors were, how would this balance out over a longer period of time? It wasn't really clear what was going on with lean mass, because there was a tiny bit of lean mass loss in the 5 weeks, but it was non-significant, and also it occurred with overall weight loss. So despite
Mm.
increasing calories, people still lost net weight, including fat. So if you lose weight, you're going to lose a little bit of muscle. It was non-significant. So it's not clear if you did this for a year, what would happen to lean mass. Given that FGF21 is muscle sparing, it's also not clear what would happen if you did this in different populations. So the population study were young, healthy men. People that are older probably have higher protein requirements. So if you put them on 9% kilocalories from protein, it might be a net negative. Or if you're trying to gain muscle, it might not be plausible. So the sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone for different people probably will be different. Again,
Mhm.
not advocating for doing this right now per se, but from an academic perspective, it's fascinating and it actually does make biological sense, based on these new understandings. So, yeah, biology has a way of humbling you if you let it. And this is one of those moments where I'm like, sugar diet's ridiculous. And a lot of the coverage I saw was ridiculous. But I'm like, wait, there's actually maybe some underlying metabolic truth. It ties into this research this way.
Hmm.
And then you can use it as just a teaching tool to say, like, look, there's actually something deeper here. Again, not recommending the sugar diet. There's many reasons that definitely could go leftward. If nothing else, it's a very low nutrient diet. You can, do 5 weeks of that. You do that for a year, you're going to develop all sorts of problems. But protein restricted diets, they might have some use cases. They might have more benefits than we realize. So anyway, interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Hmm. Well, this has been such a, interesting conversation. We've got to touch on a lot of different topics. And it's been such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure that like your website and all your socials and everything are in the caption. So thank you
Thank you so
again.
much. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Of course.